April 1945, Elbe River, Germany. American Ninth Army sat 50 miles from Berlin, closest Allied forces to the German capital. Soldiers could see the horizon where Berlin lay. General William Simpson asked permission to advance. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower said no. Stop at the Elbe. Do not advance to Berlin. Simpson stopped. Berlin fell to Soviets 3 weeks later. Eisenhower won the war in Europe, but one decision followed him for the next 24 years. This is the story of the decision Eisenhower made in April 1945, why he stopped American forces 50 miles from Berlin, and why that single choice became one of the decisions he found himself defending most often for the remainder of his days. April 1945. Eisenhower stopped American forces 50 miles from Berlin. Spent rest of his life explaining why. Subscribe. April 11th, 1945. American Ninth Army under General William Simpson reached Elbe River. Western bank secured. German resistance fragmenting. Berlin lay 50 miles east. Soviet forces were still 100 miles from Berlin, fighting through heavy German resistance on eastern approaches. Simpson's staff believed they could reach Berlin in 48 hours. 2 days of advance, minimal German forces between Elbe and capital. The request went to Supreme Headquarters, to Eisenhower. The order came back: hold at the Elbe. Eisenhower faced a decision that morning. American forces closer to Berlin than Soviets, capable of reaching capital first. Victory within grasp. But Eisenhower said no. His reasoning, documented in cables and orders, was clear. Berlin held no military value. German government had evacuated. Military command dispersed. Capturing Berlin would not destroy remaining German armies. Real objective was destruction of Wehrmacht forces, not symbolic capture of capital. Yalta Conference, February 1945, had already designated Berlin for Soviet occupation zone. Taking it would mean withdrawing later anyway. Cost in American lives to take heavily defended city was not justified by military gain. Eisenhower's decision was final. Stop at Elbe. Let Soviets take Berlin. Simpson followed orders. Ninth Army held position. But 2 men disagreed violently with Eisenhower's choice. Winston Churchill erupted when he learned of Eisenhower's decision. April 1945 cables between Churchill and Eisenhower revealed deep conflict. Churchill argued Berlin was a political symbol. Whoever took Berlin would shape post-war Europe. Leaving it to Soviets would create Soviet-dominated capital in heart of Germany. Eisenhower countered with military logic. Berlin was not military objective. Destroying German armies was goal. Political considerations were secondary to military effectiveness. Churchill grew more insistent, sent multiple cables, argued capture of Berlin would strengthen Western negotiating position with Stalin. Eisenhower held firm. Military commander made military decisions. Political concerns belonged to political leaders. The tension escalated when Eisenhower took unprecedented step. March 30th, 1945, Eisenhower sent cable directly to Stalin. Bypassed Churchill and combined chiefs. Informed Stalin of Allied plans. Asked about Soviet intentions. Churchill was furious. Supreme Allied commander communicating directly with Soviet leader without consulting British Prime Minister. But Eisenhower defended action. Coordinating military movements required direct communication, avoiding duplication of effort, preventing friendly fire between converging Allied and Soviet forces. Churchill pressed argument through April. Berlin mattered politically, even if not militarily. Eisenhower refused to change decision. American and British forces would stop at Elbe. Soviets would take Berlin. Churchill had to accept military commander's judgment, but privately, Churchill believed Eisenhower had made terrible strategic error. General George Patton also opposed the decision. Patton's Third Army was south of Simpson's Ninth Army, not as close to Berlin, but capable of rapid advance if ordered. Patton's diary entries from April 1945 reveal his position. He believed American forces could take Berlin quickly, believed stopping at Elbe was a mistake, believed Soviets were a real enemy, and taking Berlin would establish superior post-war position. According to accounts from staff officers, Patton expressed frustration in meetings, said Americans were close enough, said they should push forward before Soviets arrived. But Eisenhower's orders were clear. Third Army would advance southeast toward Czechoslovakia and Austria, not northeast toward Berlin. Patton followed orders, but recorded his disagreement in private writings. Two of Eisenhower's most prominent subordinates believed he was wrong. Churchill from political perspective, Patton from strategic military perspective. Both argued Berlin mattered more than Eisenhower acknowledged. Eisenhower held his position: military logic over political symbolism. Destruction of armies over capture of capitals. May 2, 1945. Berlin fell to Soviet forces after brutal battle. Red Army had fought through cities street by street, heavy casualties on both sides. Massive destruction. Hitler committed suicide April 30th. Remaining German command surrendered Berlin to Soviets May 2nd. Soviet flag raised over Reichstag. Symbolic moment photographed and broadcast worldwide. Western allies were 50 miles away at Elbe, had stopped there per Eisenhower's orders 3 weeks earlier. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. War in Europe ended. Berlin was in Soviet hands, would remain in Soviet occupation zone per Yalta agreements. Eisenhower's decision was complete. Berlin had been left to Soviets. Focus had remained on destroying German armies. From purely military perspective, strategy had worked. German forces destroyed. War won. Allied casualties minimized compared to urban battle for Berlin. But political consequences began emerging immediately. The war ended in May 1945. The argument about Berlin never did. Post-war period saw Soviet domination of Eastern Europe solidify. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all fell under Soviet control. Iron Curtain descended across continent. Berlin became divided city. Western sectors controlled by Americans, British, French. Eastern sector controlled by Soviets. Isolated island of Western presence deep inside Soviet zone. Questions emerged about April 1945 decision. What if Americans had taken Berlin? Would post-war situation be different? Would Soviet domination have been limited? Eisenhower began addressing the question in interviews and correspondence. His position remained consistent. Berlin decision was correct militarily. Political outcomes were not military commanders' responsibility during war. But frequency of questions increased. 1948 brought Berlin blockade. Soviets cut off Western access to Berlin, attempted to force Western allies out through starvation and isolation. Western response was airlift, flying supplies into Berlin for nearly a year until Soviets lifted blockade. Crisis reinforced questions about 1945 decision. Berlin was now flashpoint of Cold War, symbol of East-West division. Eisenhower decided to address issue comprehensively. 1948 saw publication of Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe. Entire chapter devoted to Berlin decision. Eisenhower laid out reasoning in detail. Military objectives, casualty projections, Yalta agreements, coordination with Soviets. He defended decision on multiple grounds. Military logic was sound. Casualties would have been heavy. Agreements were already in place. But defensive tone throughout chapter revealed something. Other decisions ended when the war ended. Berlin never did. Eisenhower felt need to justify decision extensively. More pages devoted to Berlin than to many actual battles. The question clearly bothered him. 1950s brought Eisenhower into political life. 1952 presidential campaign, Republican candidate, running on war record. Berlin decision came up repeatedly in debates, in interviews, in press conferences. Eisenhower explained position each time. Military decision, correct at the time, would make same choice again. But he kept having to explain it. Other war decisions did not require constant defense. Normandy invasion, broad front strategy, Operation Market Garden support. Berlin was different. Berlin required explanation again and again. 1953, Eisenhower became president, served 8 years. Throughout presidency, when discussing Cold War and Soviet threat, Berlin decision emerged. Eisenhower maintained position. Decision was militarily sound. Political consequences were separate issue. But the need to keep defending it revealed the weight it carried. August 1961, 2 years before Eisenhower's death. East German government, backed by Soviets, began construction of Berlin Wall, concrete barrier dividing East and West Berlin, preventing East Germans from fleeing to West. Symbol of communist oppression, physical manifestation of Iron Curtain. Eisenhower watched from retirement. Berlin, the city he had chosen not to take in April 1945, was now most visible symbol of Cold War division. Wall stood as reminder of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, control that had solidified after war ended. Question returned. What if Americans had taken Berlin in 1945? Would Wall exist in 1961? Eisenhower maintained his position in interviews after Wall went up. Military decision was correct. Could not have predicted political situation 16 years later. Commanders make decisions based on information available at time. But tone showed weight of question. Berlin decision had followed him from 1945 through presidency into retirement. Wall made it impossible to escape. March 28, 1969. Eisenhower died. Washington, D.C., age 78. 24 years after Berlin decision. In those 24 years, he had defended that choice more than perhaps any other decision from war. Memoir chapter in 1948. Presidential campaign explanations in 1952. Press conferences throughout 1950s. Interviews after Berlin Wall in 1961. The question never stopped. Why did you stop at Elbe? Why did you let Soviets take Berlin? What if you had pushed forward? Eisenhower's answer never changed. Military logic, casualty considerations, Yalta agreements, correct decision at the time. But the need to keep answering revealed something deeper. Was Eisenhower right about Berlin? Military analysis says yes. Taking Berlin in April 1945 would have cost American lives, urban combat, heavy casualties, for a city that would be handed to Soviets anyway, per Yalta. Their mocked armies were real target. Destroying them ended war. Berlin was symbol, not substance. From purely military perspective, Eisenhower's logic was sound. Political analysis is more complex. Berlin became symbol of Cold War. Soviet-controlled capital in divided Germany. Wall built in 1961. Flashpoint of superpower confrontation. Churchill had argued political symbolism mattered. Whoever took Berlin would shape post-war perception. Eisenhower had dismissed political considerations as outside military commanders' responsibility. Cold War suggested Churchill saw a dimension Eisenhower missed. But even acknowledging political dimension, question remains. Would taking Berlin in April 1945 have changed Soviet behavior? Would Stalin have accepted Western control of capital deep in Soviet occupation zone? Would it have prevented Iron Curtain? Historians debate. What is not debatable is this. Eisenhower made decision based on military calculus, defended it based on military logic, stood by it for 24 years, and had to explain it more than any other choice from war. Churchill disagreed. Patton disagreed. Cold War made decision look questionable. But Eisenhower never admitted error. Whether that was military correctness or human stubbornness, only Eisenhower knew. What we know is that Berlin decision haunted him differently than other choices, because it was decision that required defense long after war ended, because consequences unfolded over decades, not days, because hindsight made military logic look incomplete. Eisenhower stopped American forces 50 miles from Berlin in April 1945. And spent rest of his life explaining why. The decision may have been right, but the need to keep defending it revealed the weight it carried. Some decisions are vindicated by history. Some are questioned by history. Berlin decision was the one Eisenhower had to defend until the day he died. 1945. Eisenhower chose military logic over political symbolism. 1961. Berlin Wall proved symbols matter. 2 years before he died. Subscribe.